What is an identifier anyway? Why are there rules to follow when creating them? What are those rules? What is a convention? How is a convention different than a rule? We'll try to answer all those questions in this presentation. First of all, every programming language uses keywords to represent different processes and programming constructs. For example, you already know Java uses the words public and static and void and main and system, and, well, you get the idea. There is a whole list of keywords specific to any programming language. So what is an identifier? Is it a keyword? The answer to that is no. An identifier is something you, as a program designer, create on your own, different than any keyword, to represent something specific in your program, like a process you define, what some languages called methods, or other languages called procedures, or functions, or subroutines. These processes must be defined under some kind of name, and that name is referred to as an identifier. Data can also be represented by identifiers, especially if it is to be stored in memory for use several times instead of just a literal value in code, used once and not remembered or saved. Variables and constants, as you learned in the last lesson, are able to store data in memory, and the labels or identifiers created represent that data in a meaningful way. A process might be called calc paycheck and is meant to figure out someone's paycheck. A variable in which to store the result produced or returned by the calc paycheck process could be called my paycheck, or something like that. None of these programmer-defined identifiers are keywords that have any predefined function in a program. Instead, they are created just for the current task, and can be anything you need them to be, as long as you follow certain guidelines, some hard and fast rules, other conventions or agreements, and still other just plain good ideas. Let's talk about some of those guidelines. First, the rules. Rule number 1, an identifier cannot be a keyword or a reserved word already used in the programming language. These programming words are magic and do something already defined. Hands off any of those. Second, an identifier must only begin with an alphabet character, either upper or lowercase, or the underscore character, or a $sign, but never a numeric digit or any other symbol. Third, an identifier can only contain alphanumeric characters, or the underscore, or the $sign. No other symbols are allowed. Fourth, no spaces are allowed. Spaces, or any kind of white space like tabs, act as separators or delimiters and signal the end of an identifier. Also, most languages consider upper and lowercase letters to be different, and so the identifiers name with an uppercase N and name with a lowercase n look like the same word to us when we read it, but are considered different in modern languages like Java, JavaScript, C++, and Python. Officially, there is no limit to how long an identifier can be, but most programmers like to keep them short and easier to type. This guideline is just a common sense good idea. Let's talk about conventions now. A convention is an agreement among peers to do something in a certain way, not a rule, but an accepted practice that makes life easier for all. Generally speaking, a program will contain several different types of identifiers. Identifiers for processes, sometimes called methods, as well as for variables, by convention start with a lowercase letter and finish with all lowercase letters. Identifiers for constants, the memory locations that are permanent once assigned, are by convention all uppercase. In object-oriented programming, class names begin with an uppercase letter and finish with all lowercase letters. Now, quite often, identifiers need 2 or more words to make them meaningful, and when this happens, a convention called camel case is used, where the second word is uppercased initially, as well as the third one, or fourth, and so on, to make the first letter of each word higher than the others, easier to see, like the humps on a camel, which is why it is called camel case. Get it? Another way you can achieve visual separation without using a space is by separating multiple words using the underscore, which keeps it all connected, but still provides enough space to visually separate it for the eyes. Finally, the good ideas. We already mentioned one. Keep identifiers short to make it easier to type them over and over again, but not so short that you lose any meaning. Using single-letter variables like x and y and I are okay with loops or as array index variables, but when used to mean something like someone's name or age or wage, they're not very meaningful. A good idea is to use an abbreviation that makes it short, but still retains enough meaning to make it recognizable to anyone reading your code. A good rule of thumb is no less than 3 characters and no longer than about 10 or 15. And finally, use a variable that means what you're using it for. Like if it's somebody's name, use name. If it's somebody's age, use age. Don't use dog or cat for somebody's name and age. It just makes no sense. To summarize, when creating identifiers for your program, you have hard and fast rules that must be followed, and then conventions or commonly accepted agreements that should be followed. And finally, just some good common sense ideas.